Let me just, got it. I'll share my screen here. Make you guys little. So thanks for that introduction. As Cordy said, my name is Emily, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis. We were just chatting. I'm actually finishing up in just over a month now, so it's a busy time, and then I'll go off to do a postdoctoral fellowship with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station out of Redding. But I'll be working remotely, so I'm sticking around. I'm a Nevada City resident, going on about 2 years. Came up from UC Davis during my degree, and most of my work has been in subalpine forests, as Cordy said, where fire was very rare historically. But the final chapter of my dissertation is using a historical data set from the Sierra Nevada foothills, down in elevation quite a bit. And as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, the Sierra Nevada foothills burned very frequently historically, but in the past century and a half or so, due to fire suppression, that fire regime has changed a lot. So that's what I'll be talking about today, going over some of the ecological changes that have taken place due to fire suppression, due to the long period of fire suppression that we've had. And then as well, talking a little bit about some of the social and political will for fire suppression as a policy. And I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm honored to be presenting to such an informed and active group in this community. So thank you for having me. And again, as I said, I'm sure a lot of you are already pretty familiar with the basics of forest change due to fire suppression, but I'll be diving into a case study, the methods of cutting study, a historical study from the Forest Service archives. And I hope that diving a little deeper into it tonight and getting into the details of it, something new will stick, even for those of you who are well versed in this topic already. And then in the second part of the talk, we'll explore some historical documents and letters related to incipient fire suppression policy. And this is really just inspired by me finding and reading these documents over the last several months, and thinking they were really interesting, and hoping that you'll think the same. So we'll look at some arguments in the debate over light burning that happened in sort of the early 1900s, and also some of the cultural agendas and pseudoscience that was used to prop it up. So getting started, this is a map of the methods of cutting study that I will be talking about. The methods of cutting was actually a much larger study that the Forest Service did in the early 1900s, over 20 plots in like 8 different locations. But much of the data was lost. However, at this site in the Stanislaus Experimental Forest, the data was recovered for these 4 plots, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And they're about 8 to 10 hectare plots in which in 1928 or 1929, every tree in these plots was mapped, and then logging took place, and then everything was remapped. And there were also transects where they measured seedlings and saplings, and I'll go into more detail as you see these, the historical maps in the next photo. So I just I can't get enough of this stuff. I can't believe that they did this. This is plot number 8, and you can see each one of you probably can't read these, but each one of these little scribbles here is a tree that was mapped and measured. So they know how tall and how large in diameter these trees were, what species. And then these patches here show either tree regeneration at different densities. It was really patchy at that time, so they were able to map it in this way. And then also you can see sort of these other polygons are shrubs and rocks, logs. These are the other maps for plots 9, 10, and 11. And you can really, what's really clear here are all of this downed woody debris. You can see all of these logs. You know, imagine mapping every log in a 10-hectare plot. It's pretty incredible. And the maps were really large too. The original maps are human-sized. So then the last thing that I'll note here are these transects that go across the middle of each plot. And each of these transects contains about 100 2-by-2 meter plots that were mapped at an even smaller scale. So you can see in this plot, there was a bit of the skid trail here, some shrubs over here. But what these plots, these sort of subplots were meant to do was to document seedlings and saplings within the plot that couldn't be captured at a really large scale. So you can see, for example, this little X right here, X9. That's number 9 from the pre-logging period. It's a white fir, survived logging, and then grew throughout the post-logging period. So really incredibly detailed historical data set. And before I talk about some of the work that's been done with the resampling of this data set, and then comparing between the historical numbers and the contemporary numbers, I just wanted to show you these photos. On the left, we've got, when I went down to visit the plots last summer, when I started working with the data sets, this is a photograph from plot number 9. And in the contemporary period. And then on the right here, this is obviously not 1928, but it is an adjacent plot in a different experiment where thinning and burning has taken place. This plot was actually also logged. But thinning and burning has taken place, and I just thought that it looked a little bit like perhaps what it could have looked like pre-logging in 1928. So if we were to just take a minute and look at these two photographs and think about maybe what you see that is different in these two photographs that we're imagining. You know, one is pre-logging 1928 and one is last year. And so some of the different things that have been quantified, the differences that have been quantified in these plots are light, shrubs and ground cover, woody debris, tree size and density, and tree composition. And so I'm sure that a lot of you noted a lot of these things when you looked at the photos. And light especially is important. When talking about light, large gaps are especially important for understory species such as shrubs or regenerating trees, because they allow light to come through in a non-diffuse way, come through and actually, you know, influence the understory in a stronger manner. So there's been work done looking at the area of gaps in these plots and showing that they decreased from being about 20 to 35% of the plot area historically to being about 0 now. Shrubs and ground cover. They also looked at shrubs, and the total area of shrubs in the plots decreased from about 30% to 2.5% over almost 90 years. Woody debris, so this includes both standing snags and also fallen woody debris. And so the standing snags increased from about 15 per hectare to 140 per hectare. Woody debris on the ground, as you can see in this photo of plot 9, increased from about 28 per hectare to 76 per hectare. But really, there wasn't a lot of difference in the overall biomass of standing dead snags or coarse woody debris on the ground. So really, a lot of the increase also came with a decrease in the size of all of this woody matter, which is unfortunate for wildlife and all of the creatures that are really able to use sort of large standing snags and large downed snags, which were more prevalent in the pre-logging time period, and now have decreased. We also see a real change in tree size and density. So the overall density of trees increasing by 2.5 times. And again, just seeing a lot of this density made up of smaller individuals rather than large trees. And lastly, we see a real change in tree composition, which we'll kind of dig into more. Pine declining, so to be half of its former composition, incense cedar increasing, doubling, and white fir increasing by half again. And so we'll dig into this a little bit. These are all trees that we're familiar with, that we have around here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them already, but I'll just take a minute to describe them. White fir is one of the 2 firs that we have around here, white fir and Douglas fir. White fir is a little bit more of a classic fir, which its branches will end up forming these kind of horizontal shelves and look a lot like your typical Christmas tree. Incense cedar is more recognized by its shaggy red brown bark, and it's really distinctive winged seeds here that you can't really walk in this county without stepping on. We also in these plots have a large contingent of sugar pine, which can be identified through its big cones alone, but also from its long branches with really drooping tips, is one of the major characteristics. Sugar pine also has 5 needles. It's part of the 5-needle or white pine group, also called soft needle pines, which I think is kind of sweet. And then ponderosa pine, which is a yellow pine, 3 needles in its bunches, and puzzle piece bark that's arranged in really large rectangular chunks. And so one of the ways that we can interpret the compositional changes that we're seeing in these methods of cutting plots is in terms of shade tolerance. And shade tolerance refers to the idea that trees have different growth rates, or different trees have different growth rates at different levels of sun and shade. So for example, our ponderosa pine down here, when there is very high sun and low shade, it has the fastest growth rate of these species. And then as you move over towards white fir, in the high sun, white fir growth rates are less than that of ponderosa pine. And yet as you move more into shade, the more shade tolerant species, their growth rates decline less. So that at some point you have sort of a crossover in which in shadier conditions, these trees, the white fir and the incense cedar, are more advantaged, whereas in sunnier conditions, the pines are more advantaged. And you can also look at these 4 species on a gradient of fire tolerance. And interestingly enough, it looks about the opposite of the shade tolerance spectrum. So when we talk about fire tolerance, especially in adult trees, we're talking about bark thickness. So is it thick enough to really prevent the heat of the fire from getting to the cambium? And canopy architecture. So are their branches too low such that the fire can climb into the canopy? So we see, again, we've got pine as sort of the thickest bark without the lowest branches, whereas moving to the right here, the white fir is vulnerable to fire because of its low branches, low branching structure. And its regeneration, which often happens in sort of thickets or clumps, which is the same for the incense cedar as well. And so if we think about these trees in terms of, the idea of succession and successional time, so after a disturbance, you're going to have probably favor these more shade intolerant species that have really high growth rates in the high light environment. And then, as time goes on, some of these more shade tolerant species start growing up underneath them and eventually take over. And in successional theory says that sort of that's the end, right? The more shade tolerant species win, that's the climax of this forest community. And yet that's not what we see here in the Sierra Nevada foothills. And that is primarily because fire disturbance has been so frequent that the successional trajectory that is predicted never occurs. So this next PDF is actually quite large, so it takes a minute to load. This is a map of all the trees in plot 8 in the pre-logging period, and you can just see how much we've got, like 40 to 50% pine by basal area, looking at the adult overstory in these plots. And then the logging occurs, and most of the logging in this time period, typical logging practice was to remove the largest trees, thinning from above. And that disproportionately removed pine, because pine, not only was pine, an excellent wood for, merchantable timber, it also comprised the largest trees in the stand. And so when you took those out, you really disproportionately removed pine. You can see under here some of this white fir hanging out in the sort of lower overstory, and potentially ready to shoot up. But really what we see when we look at the resample of these data in 2016, and really kind of a similar number of pine, haven't gotten a lot of new pine since the post-logging period. Strangely enough, it looks like some of the white fir may have even died during the period between post-logging and contemporary. And incense cedar has just gone gangbusters. You can see all of this new incense cedar entering the overstory. And one of the theories for this, a lot of the change in contemporary forest really favors white fir, but that's not the case in these plots. And one of the theories for this is that this resampling happened right after the 2011 to 2014 drought, and that another environmental gradient you can arrange these species on is a gradient of drought tolerance. And the incense cedar would is more drought tolerant than the white fir. So that's one explanation for its real success here. And if we look into the understory, we actually see similar changes with incense cedar on top. So just a reminder, again, we have sort of a similar map, and these transects go across all of the plots. And if we zoom in to where this little circle is, we can again see sort of change in overstory over time, but what we want to focus on are these little dots, which show the center points of our regeneration subplots, where all of the seedlings and saplings have been tallied. And so when we summarize the seedling and sapling data, we see some more interesting stuff. So here in the pre-logging period, you can see that white fir is actually far and away the most abundant in the pre-logging understory, followed by the incense cedar with pine sort of at the bottom. We can also see that the logging really diminished seedling populations. And then in the contemporary period, that this advantage that white fir had in the pre-logging period is kind of eliminated, in that incense cedar is really pulling ahead in the understory. And if we look, so these are just counts over time. If we look by proportion of regeneration, it tells the same story. Whereas, originally white fir comprised a lot of the understory. Really in the post-logging period and the contemporary period, we see that incense cedar is comprising more of it. And one other way to sort of look at these data is in the by comparing the number of regenerating seedlings to the amount of adults or adult basal area in the overstory. And if we do that, it becomes sort of this measure of efficiency or success. How many seedlings per the same unit of adult area in the nearby forest. And the differences become even more stark. So now we're looking at individual seedlings here on the x-axis. And you can see that in the pre-logging period, now in this dark purple, white fir and incense cedar really both were pretty efficient at generating seed and seedlings from one unit of basal area. And this makes sense. They are incredibly prolific cedars. They produce up to 30 times more seed than pine per basal area. Pretty incredible. And yeah, and so you can just see that playing out in these in this data set, and even in the pre-logging period, right, that we're considering is perhaps the most old growth conditions. We see that pine really has sort of low efficiency or success in generating seedlings in that understory layer. And then as we move into post-logging, we again see sort of this, the incense cedar really pulling ahead in the pink here, and that is maintained in the contemporary period with incense cedar on top, followed by white fir, and very little pine in the contemporary overstory, compared to the amount of adult basal area of pine that's in the overstory. And so it really just makes you think, if pine always has the fewest seedlings, it's always swamped by other species proportionally in the understory, and it's consistently the least efficient in producing seed and seedlings, then how did we end up with overstories, that are 40 to 50% pine by area? And so it really it just is an interesting way to think about the influence that fire must have had historically to advantage pine, not only as, adult trees, but in the understory where cedar and white fir maybe produced sort of big thickets of regeneration that were more vulnerable to frequent fire coming through and allowed pine to get an advantage. So yeah, it's really just a cool thing to see in this historical data set, the real influence of that fire must have had on these species dynamics. And so I hope that I didn't bore you too much with that, and that reviewing the outcomes of the resampling of the methods of cutting was helpful and maybe deepened your understanding of how the forest has changed in the last century and a half. And I would like to use the rest of the time tonight to talk a little bit about the social and political context of fire suppression. So I always thought that our current predicament of denser forests and higher fuel loads that are extremely vulnerable to fire occurred because early foresters really just didn't know any better. But I think that it was more than that. And in some ways it's about hubris and sort of indistinguishable from this idea or the context of settler colonialism, which is the type of colonialism in which the home state or country, instead of sending people to extract resources from a new land, sends people to actually colonize and live on the new land where other people are already inhabiting. And you get there, and the colonists did not have hundreds and thousands of years of history and oral traditions that gave them the expertise in North American forest types, and especially, I think, in frequent forest types. And so they came and they were awed by all of these large trees, but they didn't fully understand the link between these really large overstory pines and fire. But some of the people who came were really open to these ideas and saw the Native American practices of cultural burning and understood their implications, at least to some extent, while others really pushed back. And this came to a head, if you can believe it, sometime in the 1920s, and it is termed the light burning debate. And my mentor, Eric Knapp, who is a researcher at the Forest Service out of Reading, he frames the debate between sort of two sides. And one of the sides are, colonists who are aware of Native American cultural burning practices and worried about the danger of summer fires in their new home. And this is foresters, this is ranchers, those types of folks. And then on the other side, you have these so-called Yale foresters. And these folks, I guess, Yale was sort of the preeminent institution for forestry in young America, and mostly taught forestry practices from European nations. And, in the British Empire, for example, they had long seen fire as a tool for vandalism and protest, and so it had this really negative connotation. And they were supremely worried about the impact of fire on merchantable timber, as well as regeneration. I just kind of can't get enough of this. These historical quotes from the district forester Olmsted. He says that in order to get a stand of merchantable timber, we must keep the ground well covered with a thrifty growth of young stuff and not let it burn up. If it burns, our forests of the future is lost, for we cannot plant artificially on any extended scale except at a prohibitive cost. So really just, yeah, very, very afraid of losing regeneration to fire. And here these are excerpts from a letter written by, initially written by Clinton Walker, who was a forester at the Red River Lumber Company in 1910. And he writes to the Forest Service after probably experiencing some summer fires on his property or someone else's property. And he says he respectfully requests that you have an investigation be made to see if they cannot work out some practical plan to systematically burn over forests at the right time of year. And Olmsted, who is the District 5 ranger at the time, I believe he was located in Washington, D.C., but District 5 of the Forest Service at that time is what we call Region 5 now, which includes California. And he says, well, if you do any burning, I can promise that a representative of the Forest Service will be there to watch the results. You understand, of course, that if fire should spread to adjacent government lands, you would be held responsible for any damage to government property, including the young growth of merchantable timber species. And he goes on to say, responding to some claims that I've already made and that Clinton Walker made in his letter, stories about Indian fires have as much truth in them as statements to the effect that the Forest Service is composed mostly of young graduates of Eastern forest schools, imbued with enthusiasm, but filled with all sorts of impracticable theories. So he's heard what people say about them, and he's extremely defensive about it. And so you can see this sort of interpersonal conflict and hubris that's really coming into the equation here in this debate over light burning. Clinton Walker also writes to other foresters with his concerns. And I thought this was a really interesting and kind of emotional sentence here that he writes to the folks at the Southern Pacific Company. He says, trusting that this matter will interest you and that you will look into it before it is too late. I say too late as if this policy is followed, as if this policy, meaning the policy of fire suppression, is followed a few years more, and it will be a great deal of country that will not be safe to burn over. I was just really shocked by this quote, thinking about someone in 1910 having this much anxiety and emotion around fear of summer fire. And while I did not find the response letter from the Southern Pacific Company, you can see this quote from 9 years later, and sort of assume that some of Clinton Walker's ideas took hold. As this McAllister fellow states that the Captain Kitts, who's the head of the Southern Pacific Company, isn't advocating for so-called light burning in winter and early spring. And in fact, there was some light burning that went on at this time. Here's a photograph. These are all courtesy of Eric Knapp at the U.S. Forest Service. This is a photo of a controlled burn in the Plumas National Forest. You can see just how open it is, looking through the forest, and just how little fuels are on the ground. Here again, this says it's after 2 burns had been through this area on the Plumas in 1921. Here in 1922, these are pictures of fires up on the Klamath. And here on this steep slope, you can see embers that have rolled downhill and are now burning up. And then also here, this photograph says 5 minutes after fire reached the area, probably on a slope at the same burn. But in addition to documenting sort of positive effects of light burning, um, there were also negative effects documented of the type that were really concerning to the quote unquote Yale foresters. So here we have Duncan Dunning next to this large yellow pine, probably a ponderosa pine, that has burned down during the light burning that has gone on. And so they're pretty concerned about the loss of merchantable timber. Here, this is pretty fun. It's a location where they did some light burning near Nevada City. And what they discovered was this, this is documentation of the fact that in a windstorm after the burn, many of the fire-scarred trees were the ones that broke off. And so documenting the influence of fire damage and cat faces on trees in the Nevada City area. And this is kind of fun. So this is actually, Clinton Walker finally got someone to go out and look at his light burning on his property. It was Mr. Show in 1915. And Show was, as you will see later in this presentation, vehemently against fire and the use of fire in forests in the Western United States. And so he goes up there and he provides this documentation. He says, results of light burning, spring 1915. Litter had dried out too much and fire was stopped after covering a very small area. Yellow pine tree in front of figure was killed, as was reproduction in foreground. So, you know, whether or not Clinton Walker in some of his letters writes about wanting to remove thicket growth of white fir and incense cedar in order to make room for pine regeneration. To me, it looks like some of these were probably pines, and these were maybe more intense fire effects than somebody, you know, a logger would potentially want. But it was just interesting to see what Mr. Show was really taking pictures of here. Because really a lot of the pushback against light burning was done in the name of science. So again, we have Mr. Olmsted, the district forester, saying that cultural burning and light burning were enormously destructive. And as I say, all of this is proved beyond a doubt by a study of actual conditions on the ground. It is not a theory. So citing sort of a Western scientific knowledge about light burning at the time, to my knowledge in 1910, there had been very little or almost no Western scientific study of the results of and impacts of light burning and all of that. And we'll see some of that in the upcoming slides. But he was very clear, you know, that his claims were not theoretical and they were based on science. This phrase, under the guise of science, is from a recent paper out by Kristen Vignetta, who's out of OSU or was last year. And you know, her claim is really that the science used to push back against light burning and cultural burning was basically a ruse. And some of that, you know, you'll see here. I think it's a very interesting framing because of course we know that social values influence our Western scientific questions, experiments, and findings. So here, this guy, Mr. Show, is tasked with going out and doing a bunch of research to show that the light burning theory is untenable. And so he goes out, and this first study in 1915 at Castle Rock is really looking at regeneration, the influence of the light burning on tree regeneration. And he says that they show beyond question that light burning is absolutely untenable when the establishment of new reproduction or the preservation of existing reproduction is desired. While this fact is generally recognized by foresters, the advocates of light burning have refused to admit it. He says the influence was disastrous, that 15-year-old trees were almost annihilated, and 60% of the 15 to 25-year-old tree reproduction was killed. And one note here, if you sort of dig into the numbers in this study, we look at, what's 40% of 2,660 saplings and seedlings, that's what's left over. It's about 1,000, of these pole-sized trees per acre. And 1,000 per acre is actually the stated stocking goal of the methods of cutting study that we saw at the beginning of this presentation. So they're getting a little bit anxious. A lot of the science that Show is producing is not actually giving the results that he was hoping for. And so in 1919, he and his brother-in-law Kotok got again to Snake Lake to perform more science, to show that light burning is bad. And this is Diane Smith in a 2017 Forest Service report has looked over these documents, and she writes that the stakes were so high that two men actually sabotaged their own research. They placed pine limbs alongside a few large fire-scarred pines to ensure that they would burn and demonstrate the danger of the technique to marketable timber. So pretty incredible, especially based on the claims that the Forest Service higher ups were making at the time. And one last framing that again comes from Kristen Vignetta is, something that I think is pretty important is that, some of that pushback to light burning at the time may have been because of, may have been an anti-Indigenous sentiment. So Vignetta writes that the Forest Service racialized light burning by associating light burning with Indigenous peoples. They called it Paiute forestry, which is sort of an overgeneralization, and they said it sort of as a slur, in that this was lacking Western scientific expertise and support. And in addition to that, there's this extremely alarming language here from Klamath National Forest map in 1929, in which they used the colonists' sort of fear of fire on the landscape in order to actually incite violence against Native people. It is not a fire hunt, but a manhunt. Not fire, but the owner of the hand that lights it is the public's enemy. So some really pretty intense and nasty stuff here. Also, she writes that the knowledge behind light burning, which comes from cultural burning, was discredited in several ways. First, through the narrative of the savage Indian, and this goes back to sort of the idea of Paiute forestry, that Western scientific knowledge is somehow civilized, whereas the cultural knowledge was not. Downplaying with the vanishing Indian narrative, that Indigenous peoples who were declining in numbers due to genocide and violence and disease were actually gone, which is not true. And lastly, erasure, by talking about moving westward into empty territory, which was actually territory that was currently occupied by Native people. And so, I think that this is sort of another interesting framing of the political pushback against light burning and burning at the time, that if that had been accepted by the Forest Service or by the government of the United States of America, that then they would maybe have to acknowledge a group of people that they did not want to acknowledge. So if we sort of look at light burning a little bit through time here as we come towards the end, originally the elements of light burning that come from the cultural use of fire that was used time immemorial. So that's where the standard practice is coming from, really right until about the gold rush period, in which light burning was demonized, criminalized, and vanquishment was attempted. Then this sort of resistance in the period of the light burning debate that we discussed tonight, which eventually turned into fire suppression, a period of fire suppression that is has been detrimental to Western forests, and unfortunately in the last couple of fire seasons especially has resulted in some vindication of the light burners. And then here, is the question, will light burning become standard practice again? Is that something that culturally we're ready for, that we can put into practice, even as the climate warms and we have fewer burn days? And I hope that, yes, I hope that this is true. And really, this is where I see the YBBC really showing up for the community. And I just want to thank you all for what you do. Here is a photograph. This is the one burn that I've been to with the YBBC. This was at Janaea Donaldson's property last year. And here's a burn that I was at earlier this spring in Mariposa, just acknowledging the fact that, as groups like yours put fire back onto the land, you're doing really incredible work, necessary work, and restoring bonds of community with each other and with the land that have been empty for quite a while. So thank you. And thanks for your attention tonight. I will take any questions that you have here in the last couple of minutes.
That was awesome, Emily. Thank you so much. Some of those quotes had me cracking up behind the screen from Homestead. But anyway, I'm actually going to go to the beginning of the chat. And I'd love if folks could kind of speak for themselves. So Brendan, if you could kind of go ahead, and then Amber, I'll let you cover it, your question. And then folks can either chime in or raise their hand with the 5 or 10 minutes we have left.
Yeah, I was just wondering, at the very beginning when we were looking at the maps with the dots showing the timber surveys, was there a minimum DBH before something was considered a tree, or were they looking at like inch tall little seedlings? Or
yeah, it was 9 centimeter DBH was the minimum for trees. Good question. Yeah, it would have been, I mean, and those were the only ones that they mapped as well. So then anything below the 9 centimeter cutoff, that was what was shown in the smaller or square 2 by 2 meter
transects. Okay, awesome, perfect.
And I guess I should say this data set has been all of the overstory and the mapped regeneration. It has all been digitized and is actually recently available online through the Forest Service website. So if you're interested in looking at it, it's in a geodatabase that you can easily open up in ArcMap. Using it for your own presentations. If you can't find it easily online, then just feel free to contact me, and I'm 95% sure it's already up, and if not, it'll be up soon.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Cordy, for letting us jump in. My, I guess, early question was, I think I'd heard you said that cedars have some sort of advantage over other species, like initially, and I was wondering what that meant. Like, is that their ability to like penetrate the duff layer, or what is it about them?
I think maybe what I was talking about, there are 2 of the environmental gradients that I mentioned tonight in which cedars have an advantage. One of them is that they are more drought tolerant than white fir, I believe. Although I guess sort of on par with ponderosa pine, if we're gonna, if we're really gonna get detailed. But then they can be advantaged in lower light environments than pine as well. Although they're sort of in the middle between pine and white fir. I guess one other thing that I would say is they are extremely prolific cedars. And so, the combination of the high seed output and also drought tolerance was sort of my theory as to why they've really been the winners in this particular data set. Yeah.
That makes sense. Like straddling multiple factors is to their advantage. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of right in the middle there.
I'll hand it back to the other person because there was maybe another comment or question.
Oh, Brandon put in a very funny comment in the chat. But yeah, so if nobody else has any other comments or questions, Emily, thank you so much. That was such an interesting perspective and a really telling perspective. And I think even just like the litigation comment from Olmsted, I was like, oh my gosh, liability was starting back in the 1910s. And that's why we're so litigious. But anyway, with that, I'll just say thank you to everybody. And I'll send out the recording. I do apologize. Apparently this meeting was initially advertised as 7 to 8 p.m. So I caught a couple people logging on late and I think that was my fault. So I'll send out the recording. Other than that, Emily, if you have any final words, I'll log us off.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, it was really a pleasure to be here tonight, and I hope to meet those of you who I haven't met in person and around. So thanks for your attention.